Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Taylor Black. Taylor directs AI and venture ecosystems inside of Microsoft's Office of the CTO, where he runs the incubation studio and co-leads a 25,000 member technical community. He also founded the Leonum Institute for AI and Emerging Technologies at the Catholic University of America. He teaches at the University of Washington Foster School of Business and advises the U.S. Embassy to the Holy See on AI and human flourishing. All of this ties to his single conviction that the right response to more powerful AI is better formed humans. The conversation we had centers on a distinction where Taylor draws a hard line between intelligence and insight. A machine can gather all the evidence, run all the patterns, and tell you this is probably true. But only a human knower can make the categorical leap into, yes, this is true. He calls reaching that kind of certainty the virtually unconditioned. What that means in plain English is that there's a depth of understanding that compute cannot totally replicate. But the more that AI can do, the more it actually matters that the human running the machines has actually developed that depth of thought. And in my opinion, that's a call to action. We get into what he calls the anthropology-first approach to building ventures, the idea that every product you shipped carries an implicit view on what a human being is, whether you intend it or not. We also talk about the danger of using AI as an oracle that lets people skip the productive struggle. We also get into his concept of cold storage, where he uses AI as a context engine to shelve good ideas early and monitor it for the right conditions in the marketplace or trends or behaviors that could revive good ideas for the future. And we also get into the question that should be on the top of the mind of anyone developing or building a business today. The question is not what can we build, but what ought we build? All right, let's dive into it. Taylor, you mentioned something specific around AI is going to be far smarter than humans. However, that means we need to have well-formed humans. And I want to kind of understand your thesis because we're probably going to spend the majority of our conversation breaking bit by bit down. If AI is going to have abundance and intelligence will be abundance, then impossible tasks will seem more possible to us, or at least merely hard tasks, not impossible. But then you also argue that we still need insight and that a human person is the only one that can provide insight. And then the argument that we need to form better humans, which I'm completely aligned with all those three arguments. The question that I have, though, is if that's true, how do you distinguish between intelligence and insight?
Yeah, so we have this, the AI is based off of the rough biological structures of our own minds, neurons, and all that wonderful stuff. But we know things in a variety of different ways. And there's been a bunch of literature on this, both in philosophy, in books like Blink, in neuroscience tomes, all that sort of thing. But the one that I think is most relevant for our conversation today is to look into your own interiority of how you've ever come to know something, right? And I'm gonna articulate this in a felt sense, and any of the listeners to our pod today can do this themselves too. But there's this concept of human knowing, and we know in a variety of different ways, called statistical knowing. And that is where we have enough data points that we are pretty sure that something is the case. We're not certain about it, but we're certain enough for the piece of knowledge serving in a certain way for the groundedness of our reality. So for example, like if you're driving a car and you're taking your car around the curve of a road, you aren't absolutely certain that you're following the perfect curve in order to take your car on that turn. You don't have all of the data points down to the level of granularity that you actually feel like you might. You also don't have all of the mechanics between your hands on the steering wheel all the way down to the steering train for your car measured out to that level of accuracy too. There's kind of a good enough for you driving that car around the curve that you're comfortable with, and it fits. It's practical. I got that there, and so I give that as an example of statistical knowing. There's another kind of knowing, though, that is unique to humans, and this is where I think the categorical difference between human knowing and statistical knowing is human knowing in the more like the insight sort of fashion that you mentioned in your question. And when you have an insight, you are grasping what I would call the virtually unconditioned, which means that you've all the further pertinent questions that you need to pursue in order for you as a knower to posit, yes, that is true. And there's a number of different things in your life where you do this, right? Some of my favorite examples end up being like the big choices we've made in life, right? Getting married or believing in some sort of religion or knowing that you would do like anything for your child, for example, or even knowing things that help frame your entire worldview. Now, this is a very strange kind of knowing to talk about it in kind of the secular sense or even the neurological sense, because it's very different from what I would call scientific knowing, which ends up being this is true given in under a very strict set of conditions that I'm able to replicate in a lab, right? A lot of people might say that they believe in science or that science is real, but if you unpack that a little bit, it's really hard to live your life completely according to everything that is known only by science, right? Because
You can't prove math exists; it just exists.
exactly, right? It's really complicated. And so what we actually believe informs our worldview, informs the way in which we bop about in our existence, ends up being much more following that unrestricted desire to know, which each of us has inside us, to follow out those further pertinent questions to say, yep, I believe this to be true for myself. And as a result of me believing it to be true, I believe other people also could see this as truth. And that moment of insight is when you are able to come to that realization that something is true, that something is real in that particular sense.
That we can grasp it. I think one
Yep.
thing that I've read and heard was that when you understand a concept, like you understanding animal kingdom or what a universe is, it's not it's not a duplicate of that existence in your mind, but it's the actual mirror of that thing in your mind that you can harness and understand. Which is, I think, what you're saying is more of a metaphysical knowing at that point, and that's we're not going to dive too deep into
Yeah,
that stream, but that's the abstract.
it is. Yeah, and you can also think of it as you've understood something about reality, knowing that there is so much more to understand about it. So, for example, if you're walking down my street with my kids, right, and I look at a house, I can see the paint on the house. I've actually framed and built a couple of houses when I worked in construction in high school. And so, as a result of that experience that I've had, I can look at a house and see things that somebody who hasn't framed a house can't see because they aren't looking, that isn't part of the further pertinent questions that they're asking. Now, the same thing can happen with if I walk with my friend who's a botanist. She will be able to see things in flowers that I can't see, that aren't there
It's
for
the
me in a
nuance.
kind of reality sort of sense because I'm not asking that kind of question around it. And so you can imagine the universe kind of being this way for everybody, which is there are further pertinent things I could ask about almost anything that I encounter. All of that is being mediated by my understanding, being mediated by my wanting to seek out those further pertinent questions so that I can reach that virtually unconditioned, so that I can have the insight into what that thing is.
And what you're saying is that right now, when we leverage this quote unquote intelligence, and I think the vernacular has been argued, is it the right word to use or not? But that's what we're calling it just moving forward. We're renting or
Yeah.
we're using this intelligence, we're renting or running this compute, but it's different from the actual knowing. How do you distinguish that though in practical use cases? And we can talk about like ventures and business and value creation, but how do you distinguish that specifically in practical execution for daily using the technology?
Yeah, certainly. So they end up being ways in which a tool that we can use in order to come to insights ourselves. I see LLMs, generative AI, as being really good at helping us pattern our experience so that we're able to come to an insight. If we ask it for like true information, and this ends up being kind of an alignment question, which I love the term alignment because it begs further pertinent questions, right? Alignment to what? But if we're asking that kind of question, hey, is this true? The machine can't really say, yes, I posit this as like the correct understanding of reality, which is what we're saying when something is true. It will reference in its own training data or internet data. Here are the sources that I relied on in order to come to the very strong recommendation that this is the way in which you should perceive reality. I'm not saying it, Claude, am positing that this is true. I am assembling all of these underlying resources and telling you this is likely the case. Now you, knower, go and make that affirmation. Even if we do architect the system so that it would say something is true, that's our architecture of it, where it is comparing what we've asked, or comparing what data it has against something that some developer or us as a builder of the system has said, when it looks like this, then you can say that it is true. The machine itself can't make that categorical leap.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. And one of the practical phraseologies is you can't outsource your judgment or your own thinking. But again, we can dive into like mechanics, and I like to call them ingredients of how you actually run them. You don't just go to
Sure.
this thing.ai or .com and you start chatting away. That's a basic approach, but there's much more that we can dive on. What I do want to understand though is I don't know if it's the second or the first, forming better humans. And I want to
Mhm.
understand when you see this in real life, like running new ventures, either at Microsoft or new ventures in the venture studio. How does that, because that's the thesis. If you're better formed, then you're going to be able to have better insight or intuition into whatever for value creation. How have you seen that with the ideas or concepts or value creations, we call them ventures, inside a huge firm, and then as well as what you're building outside of that?
Yeah, certainly a lot of it has to do with the way in which you're architecting the conditions under which a decision can be made. One of the reasons why, and one of the major things investors look for in a founding team, for example, is not only kind of the broad subject matter expertise, but the tenacity to be able to sit with the tension of inquiry, and extend that tension of inquiry for as long as is necessary to posit that something is actionable, right?
Mm,
And you can imagine this, like the archetype, of course, is like the researcher in his study or her study, like slaving away at the table, like running an experiment, and knowing that it isn't good enough. Like the data isn't there for them to say, at last I have come to the realization, or at last I have the answer to this particular question.
mm.
They are able to sustain that tension of inquiry until that checks out, right? And that ends up being a major formative piece because you can truncate the search and say, it can't be found, or this is good enough, but still have that kind of lingering feeling in the back of your head, like there's still the work to be done.
Yeah.
And to me, that ends up being one of the major pieces of formation. If you're not able to sit with that tension in finding the right answer and finding what qualifies as product market fit, we have all these amazing stories about Jobs, right, where apocryphal or not, dropping the iPhone into the thing of water and seeing bubbles is like, hey, we still have space we can use in there. It's that sort of drive where like, no, this isn't good enough. Like we can still get there and we can't stop.
Mhm.
And knowing and having the judgment to know when you do need to stop too, because
Yeah, no,
that's a
there's a
fine
fine line between pushing,
line to walk.
how long is your ultra when you do ultra running? Like,
Exactly.
technically, ultra's beyond 24 miles. When do you
Hmm.
stop? When do
Hmm.
you call like that? Now it's like so that makes a lot of sense. But practically, so you're hitting an anthropologically or anthropology first approach to
Yes.
venture creation, and you're saying that it matters a lot more than just being a practical founder and practical product market fit. There's much more to push, and I think that's sounds like a leadership aspect and like a culture
It,
aspect versus just the practicality of a product.
it is, but also there's time you have a human like building something, they're making decisions around what to build. And so even laying out, and so I work particularly in venture studios, and venture studios are just frameworks for running rapid experimentation and making decisions more quickly and thoroughly as a result of rapid experimentation. And so even Rise and Fall of Nations ends up having to tying back to how individuals do or do not sit with that tension of inquiry and come to better judgments and better understandings as a result of that.
Mm.
And so I wrap in this kind of cognitive theory into venture building itself because it's that is it good enough for my customer, or is it something that I'm just willing to ship? And it's there that the tension lies of I need some more data before I can make the decision around that virtually unconditioned as to whether this interface is sufficient for my customer journey, so my customer delights in it and I find my product market fit. And therein, and there's frameworks to make that easier for us as humans. But us as humans also need to have that tenacity, have that drive, get to that point.
It's a
And
relentless
I think
approach to it
exactly,
specifically.
exactly. Yep.
Do you think that's the only principle you're looking at on the anthropology first? Like the tension of good enough to ship, and sometimes people are lazy. It's like it's good enough for now, but always consistently R&Ding and improving. So I get that reality, and I'm on the ship first approach. Ship first, figure it out, continue to improve as we continue. I'm just like that's who I am. But is that the only
But
principle? Or is there something else that you're looking at
no, but
past
that's a good
this?
principle, right? Because what you understand about your own coming to that aha moment of, "Oh, I found it," is that, no, the best way for me to gather data as to the further pertinent question of product market fit is for me to ship small aspects of what I am building, get that feedback loop so that I then can say, "Ah, yes, okay, I solved that minor problem that leads towards answers to the larger problem of product market fit."
Mhm.
And so it's being aware of your metacognitive strategies as you approach your work, I think is invaluable in your work. And even more so when you're working alongside an intelligence like artificial intelligence, where you are offloading pieces of your thinking in thoughtful, appropriate ways to the machine that is cranking through the examples or cranking through the data or cranking through the build, the code, whatever.
The build plan and the execution. Yeah.
Exactly, where you're comfortable with that because it's fitting within your overall framework of it needs to be able to answer these evals, whether that's evals you've built or the eval inside your own head, which is this is enough data for me to posit reality and move forward to the next virtually unconditioned.
I like to look at some of those frameworks. One of the things that I've done is created hard rules, like laws, right? So a hard
Mhm.
rule is that the agent, if it's in its memory, it might say, Psh, I'm not going to follow this thing. But if you make it a hard rule, like a law, then it has to pass through certain gates for it to actually take it. I'm explaining that to the audience. I know you get that very back of your hand. And
No, it's
one of the
good.
things that
Yeah.
I've done specifically is like an ethos of human flourishing. Like you can't just
Mhm.
agree, you have to find truth, you have to push me to the extreme. You can't just do something to cut a corner if it's going to harm a human, or if it's going to be just to get to
Yeah.
the right answer, cut corners. Like all these, like this 9 principles, fundamental principles, and I instituted them as laws in the infrastructure that I built, which
Mhm.
helps me help it make sure that we're following what I believe through my
Yep.
insight to be a path forward to build, and it has proven, at least to this point, fruitful. So I think that's a practical takeaway. I want to ask you and look at the other axis of insight, or another prong of insight. And that's the prong of what ought we to build? And it's not what should
Mm.
you build? Because you can literally build anything right now. And one of the key things is
Mhm.
like you got to point these tokens to something valuable. And me being the
Yeah.
knucklehead I am, I just pointed it to revenue stuff in the beginning. Since playing around since the ChatGPT days to now, like it's all rev. How can I increase revenue, make the ROI super obvious? And then now with more
Yeah.
products and whatever. But what ought we to build? Better formed humans, more insight. How do we answer that question of ought? Which is different. What
Yeah.
should
I
you or
mean,
can you?
yeah. It's a hard question, and I think it ends up being unique to every individual. I'm a 0 to 1 guy. I like once it gets to 1, once you find product market fit, my interest, dries up very quickly, and we all know if you're not, like, super interested in the thing, you can probably grind through it, but it's not gonna be as good as the guy who loves running from 1 to 100. And you can tell the energy difference, you can tell the desire to follow through on the tension of inquiry for answering the next set of questions that's necessary to get from 1 to 100, right? But I'm not that guy. I'm the 0 to 1 guy. I like the thing that's like, what if this was a thing? And let's prototype it out. Let's turn the idea into something that we can iterate on, something that we can wrap a business model around, something we can find some customer validation on. And so I think the answer to that question ends up being very unique. And this lends itself even to that formational aspect where if I don't know that about myself, then I could be stuck doing stuff that really isn't bringing me meaning or bringing me joy. Not that everything has to, right? We've all ground through
You learn through that experience. It's a tough task to
exactly,
pay sometimes if you don't feel aligned, but
exactly.
know thyself.
But there's a formational aspect to it, right? And it's hard to do without that pain.
Yeah, no, yep, absolutely. So that's an insight of knowing yourself and that insight that you bring to the table when you build. What have been some of the insights that either you're leveraging or depending upon for what you're building right now, or that you might have learned as you build from the 0 to 1, being the 0 to 1 guy, but just
Yeah.
consistently over time?
Yeah, I think that there's a number of different things, I think. One of the fundamental ones, I think, is this concept of humility. And humility for me is being able to see a situation from somebody else's perspective, right? If I'm proud, then I'm preferencing my own perspective over something else. Where if you're humble, then you're doing a better job at listening and you're able to see reality through somebody else's eyes in a better way. I think it's fundamental to innovation because it's fundamental to understanding the problem better. If I don't understand the problem from the perspective of my customer, then I'm not able to build what my customer actually needs. So that's an aspect of it, an aspect of being able to sit with and empathize and see reality through the kinds of problems that your customer is encountering that you have this desire to solve.
Mm.
I've seen many, and I've been one of the entrepreneurs who built the thing and fell in love with the solution, right? And falling in love with the solution is, of course, the fastest way to tank your startup because you lose sight of the problem. So that's one thing, applying this framework to venture building. The other thing, too, is that when you come to understandings of how you operate and how you believe the world operates as a result of kind of this framework for thinking, you're able to distill out certain kinds of playbooks for solving certain kinds of operational problems.
Mm.
So the venture studio mechanism in my mind, and I've built several of them, is a way of kind of applying this concept of idea flow. Jeremy Utley who teaches at the Stanford D School, wrote this excellent book on what he calls idea flow. But it's a methodology for taking an idea, experimenting with it, stretching the idea out, prototyping it, not just from a product design perspective, but also a business model perspective, also a understanding the problem better perspective. And it ends up being a rubric that you can follow for iterating through idea to prototype to incubation to launch. And being able to have a framework to manage your thinking, to know where you are in the different loops of doing that so that it becomes more efficient. That ends up being, I think, a really powerful thing falling out of this understanding of how human minds work that I found a lot of value in over the course of my career as well.
That's fascinating. How human minds work and the falling out of that, and I like how you frame that. To shift some of the conversation, I think I call it like the theology of AI. Like some people worship it, other people fear it, and that's like an oversimplification of the
Sure.
scenery out there. Like there's multiple schools of thought. There's 9 or 12 prominent ones, and then big categories around it. Working with multiple founders, adventure studios, team members, personnel, like who have different viewpoints of the technology. How do you harness all that to the end goal that you have, which is an anthropology first approach, and as well one for value creation? How do you work with all those like they could be dichotomies and mindsets and approaches to the technology?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a really powerful way I've found of framing this is from the user experience problem that your user co-creating products with you, right? Before November 2022, we mostly, as technologists, built deterministic products where we could test out every possible experience that the user would have as a result of using our thing. And we could put it in front of, as we were building it, we could put it in front of users and tell them to do the thing and watch them do the thing and understand what was happening from soup to nuts. With probabilistic products, and this is both gen and agentic, right? The user is co-creating experiences that we can't fully anticipate.
And that are
And a
unique to
lot
them,
of,
by the way. Depending on how they
yeah,
use the technology, or if they're using a subscription, it behaves differently depending on how you behave, and the model,
yep,
how it actually behaves based on your worldview and demographic for some models, which is fascinating.
exactly.
So it's a two-sided
It is,
approach.
yeah, and it makes it so complicated, right? Particularly because a lot of is happening inside their head. You can ask them like how they're thinking about it, and you can get some kind of answer. But generally, people aren't very great about thinking about how they're thinking either. And so there's this gap now between you being able to understand what the user is actually experiencing when you're building your product.
Yeah.
And so, why does this matter for product makers? You're making a product for a human, and thing that you ship has an implicit anthropology, whether you want it or not.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is that you have assumptions about your user and how your user operates that you can't verify purely by watching them. And you can't verify purely by having a science of how the electrons and neurons are firing in their brain. And so there's this gap that is called anthropology that you're shipping whether you like it or not.
Mm.
And so if you want to get that anthropology right, it's probably helpful to try on a bunch of different kinds of anthropologies for your product and see which one works the best.
How do you do
This
that?
is it's an interesting problem. Part of it is, I think, codifying different behavioral pathways that you want the artificial intelligence to augment or to circumvent when the user is interacting with your product. Part of it too, I think, is trying out different ways in which you think that your user actually operates from an intellectual standpoint, how they actually make decisions, um, how you want this technology to interact with their working styles, with their working modalities.
Mhm.
And I think actually we're running into a bunch of different problematic kind of ways in which we interact with the technology. Well, we can flex. We're very flexible as human beings, right? And we can flex around it and mold ourselves to the technologies rather than changing the technologies to better fit ourselves. But I think we lose something
Hmm.
in the interim there, where if you're able to make a tool that fits better, then the person using it is going to have a better experience in building with it, in developing with it, or thinking with it. And it's up to us to design towards that end. Perhaps a good example of this is utilizing AI in the
Yeah.
K through 12 classroom, right? The design modalities currently that I've experienced currently, even with options like a learn mode in ChatGPT, don't necessarily sustain the tension of inquiry long enough to help the student understand how to do that better. And so what the student ends up doing is using the tool as an oracle to give answers that the student doesn't want to figure out for themselves. Well, that's problematic. The whole point of
It's a skill
school, the
set.
whole
Yeah,
point of like
definitely.
teaching is developing that, right? You want them to pass the marshmallow test. You want them to be able to
Yeah.
suffer through a little bit so that they can read something like Ivanhoe and make their way through a 400-page book because of the awesomeness that's there, or think through a complicated geometric proof. And I think we can get there, but notice that those all end up being design decisions around a particular view of anthropology that you may or may not hold. And my anticipation is the closer you are to reality, whatever you want that to be from a secular point of view. I have my own point of view as to what reality is, but from a pure product standpoint, right? The closer you are to reality of how humans actually operate, and there is a way, the better your products are going to help that person flourish.
Yeah. And depending, even like, so there's a lot to unpack here because you hit like a really big philosophical point, but even to the practical point of even if the user is an agent and the agent buys your product, it's still a human that dictated, go do this thing, go buy these things or tools that are necessary. Because there's a lot of new products that are just purely for agents. Like the consumer
Yep.
or the end
Yeah.
user is an agent, but we have to understand it's still a human at the back end making these decisions, deploying
Yeah.
that. But I find it fascinating too. So it's using the heuristic of what kind of view of anthropology, because this is like the beginning of all philosophy. What is reality? How do I talk about reality? Based on
Hmm.
that, what is human, which is anthropology? How do I treat human based on that? So it's anthropology and ethics, because treating people is through a product at that point, because that's
Yeah.
how you treat
Well,
humans, and depending on who they are, and like their stance or their worth or their worthlessness, if you believe that to be true. So
there's also an interesting parallel to how you treat tools and agents as well, because as we know, the literature proves out that the same sort of psychological tricks that expert negotiators or con artists use also work on LLMs. And so there's a certain amount that we have mirrored the way in which humans operate into the algorithmic biases of these systems such that they can be gamed in very similar ways. And it's there in the scientific literature.
yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? Oh, it's wild. As well as knowing that you never know. Got to be nice to your LLM, your little.
Yeah.
Oh
Well,
man,
and you can get the answers you want that way. I mean, there's some fascinating studies done by some of my colleagues where if you put a line from a psalm in with your prompt, there's a measurable difference in how morally aligned the responses can be. This is even true if you do something like put an image of the Annunciation in with your prompt. The model will change its behavior in a way that humans understand as being morally codified in its response in a direction or another.
that's interesting.
And yeah, it's fascinating.
I would always think. I mean, this is the first time I'm making this analogy, but I think there's the prompt engineering, but I think there's also the approach of the system that you built around it. Because I mean, you have to use a harness to
Hmm.
leverage the LLM. The harness, I think, is like an engine. Like it's a.
Yep.
I like to watching the Bruce McLaren like come up story and how he
Hmm.
built his own engines like by hand, and I thought it was
Hmm.
pretty sweet. So like the harness is the engine. The LLM, I think, is the driver. So you can swap out drivers
Hmm.
whenever you want. But there's also some technical components around that because you also have like the wheels, the whatever, the suspension, the types of
Hmm.
whatever mechanics. Like I'm not obviously an expert in it, but and these are all the different components that you have, like the primitives, the agents, the skill set, the memory, the hard rules, etc. And what I'm seeing is that when you set up that system at a certain way, like your own engine,
Hmm.
sometimes the driver can be an okay driver, and you still
Hmm.
can go pretty fast. Or
Yeah.
like like alluding to like quality of output or quality of thing, but you're also saying that the way that you actually treat, like the way the driver thinks, determines which is back to square one, or
Yeah.
better form,
Well,
better formed insight.
yeah, but like the harness is taking into account the proclivities of the driver and guiding them in certain directions. I mean, and so you're already assuming something about the engine, the driver itself, the LLM, so that you're able to do a better job of directing it.
Yeah, I think it's more important to design the engine than to hope on one
Yep.
LLM
Yeah.
versus the other.
Yes.
At
100%.
least what I'm
Yeah.
testing. It's fascinating. Any cool projects that you're working on right now, or any cool projects in the incubators of the venture studios that are exciting you that you're allowed to share?
Yeah, certainly. So I've been experimenting with this concept that I call cold storage. And there's this kind of perennial problem in venture building where it's I have a good idea, but I don't have the right team, or I have a good idea, but after a year of working on it, the market isn't there. In
Hmm.
fact, I had a startup a number of years ago that hit this really well. It was an app that was using near field communication to create local networks between cell phones. So you can imagine being at and I'm a huge electronic music fan. And so my use case was I go to these festivals all the time and nobody has any coverage because we blow the cell tower out or we blow the router out because they just can't handle that many connections. What if I just had a low latency text message capability that just used everybody else's phones around me as kind of a near field communication network to talk to my buddy on the other side of the venue. And it's a fantastic idea. And I had a lot of energy around it. People thought it'd be great. Ran into the problem that the near field communication protocols were just not where they needed to be. And
Hmm.
in fact, it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that they have gotten to where they need to be for that sort of application. So that experience, also others in that space, is I came up with this concept of what I call cold storage of, well, what are the things that need to change in order for that idea to move forward? And so
Hmm.
rather than killing the idea, I put it into cold storage and say, these are the things that would need to change in order for this to be able to move forward. Now, the problem with putting an idea into cold storage from a venture standpoint is that the team disappears, the people who remember the idea
Yeah, the
disappear, and
energy.
exactly, you go back to your projects that you have from 5 years ago and you're like, what even was this? But AI is a fantastic context engine.
Hmm.
I don't know, I give it all of the context around the projects, the reasons why it won't move forward, and tell it to monitor the reasons so that if
Hmm.
the right team member or person who has a PhD in X or publishes a paper in Y hits archive, or the technology shift happens so that near field communication can go 15 feet between devices, or the market conditions change so that all of a sudden a billion more people are doing electronic music concerts or something like that. Each of those ends up being something that can be monitored by my AI context engine to say, hey, time to dust this idea off. And by the way, here was the idea. Here was all the
Here's
meetings
the
associated
contact.
with it,
Yeah.
all of the artifacts, whole context, so that even if I bring in a new person, they're able to stick their head into the context engine and be like, got it. Let's now move that forward off the shelf. What this does is it gives you a lower barrier to killing something because you're able to revive it more quickly. And one of the hardest things in venture is being able to kill your darlings. And so being able to do that in a cold storage standpoint and build out a
Becomes IP
consortium
though.
of
That becomes
other.
IP that's stored there
It
that can
does.
be deployed. So who owns it? How do you store it? That's an interesting product.
And there's great ways of doing that in fractional standpoints too, and that AI is really good at parsing out. And anyway, so I'm super excited and jazzed about that concept because it allows for more fluid collaboration between venture studios.
It'd be pretty interesting if that was even, I don't know if it would be open source, but it would be interesting because there's a lot of idea people, but not the right person to run the company. But they're brilliant at hitting something PMF in the beginning, but they just suck at running the
Yeah.
team. So they can put that there. Then someone who is good at running a team can just take that on. And it's almost like an exchange of
Yep.
a real incubation center.
100%. And I've operated this in prototype ways in 2 different ecosystems, and it's been really interesting to see the effects. Yeah, so I'm excited to push that forward more and have it impact the real world. So, yeah.
I like it. Taylor, where can people go to thank you for being on, learn more about your writing, and connect with you?
My Substack is great, innovate.pourbrew.me. That's a great place. And also LinkedIn. I share a lot on LinkedIn, not only because I work at Microsoft and the CTO of Microsoft is a LinkedIn founder, but I just like the conversations that happen there.
Put those links in the show notes. Taylor, thanks again for being on.
Dude, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. If you'd like to get more of these podcasts, please go ahead and subscribe to wherever you're watching or listening to the pod. If you have any suggestions or questions that you want me to answer on the pod, or you have a guest that you want me to interview, please go ahead and email me all of your suggestions and questions at podcast@dogoodwork.io. That's podcast@dogoodwork.io. If you'd like to give me public feedback, you can go on Apple Podcasts, and from there, you can leave up to a 5-star review. I would greatly appreciate that. If you like more free resources where you can get my best strategies to help you increase your company's performance and scale profitably, you can get handpicked articles to propel your growth, and you can get trainings and discussions that I give freely online, as well as low-cost resources such as my books and guides. You can get all of that by going to dogoodwork.io/resources. 90% of all of these resources are not behind any email opt-ins. You can get instant access by going to dogoodwork.io/resources. Now, if you'd like to accelerate your progress and shorten the gap between information and action and start seeing results in your business, let's work together to increase your company's performance and scale profitably and serve more clients without the overwhelm. You can request a free clarity call to see how we can best support you to reach your goals by going to dogoodwork.io/apply. Again, that's dogoodwork.io/apply. As always, it's an honor to be a small part in your journey. This is Raul Hernandez. Do good work.